Welcome to Part 3 of A Christian Case for Bitcoin. Part 3 is titled Bitcoin, a Sound Weight and Measure. If Part 1 and Part 2 were about identifying the problems with the current monetary system and how they are incompatible with biblical law according to the scriptures, then Part 3 is about presenting a technological solution to this problem. Bitcoin is a complex and multifaceted discipline. There really is a lot to cover, and it's difficult for me to convey all of the nuances of Bitcoin and its technical design in such a short lecture. However, I'm going to do my best to take some of these complex topics and break them down in a way that's easy to understand. And hopefully by the end of this, I expect that if I've done a good job, you'll understand how Bitcoin works, and you'll naturally see it as the obvious next technological innovation of money. I also expect that after developing a decently thorough and broad understanding of Bitcoin, you'll come to understand why Bitcoin is not crypto. The two are not synonymous, and crypto does not help us solve this problem of trusted third parties in the final settlement of money. In our first two lessons, we covered the identification of some modern problems if we consider God's law as sovereign over economics. As I said, in this third lesson, we'll focus primarily on how we can engineer technological solutions to this problem that we have of money being corrupted. As we can see by the spectrum on the screen, Bitcoin is a cross-section of a lot of different disciplines. You have economics, geopolitics, computer science, and distributed systems. Each of these categories has subcategories that you could further break down into nuanced and esoteric topics. We don't have time to get into all of that today. I'm going to try to paint with a broad brush here and give you a wide understanding of the topic at hand. The first thing I would like to talk about is something that as Christians we should be relatively familiar with, and that is the invention of the Gutenberg press. Now, I would argue that the Gutenberg press was a fundamental pillar to the Protestant Reformation, led by Martin Luther, who nailed his 95 Theses to the church door. The 15th century revolutionized information in a way that was very different than any other event that had happened in human history up until that point. Johann Gutenberg, a German inventor, invented the printing press around 1440 in Mainz, Germany. Through a use of clever engineering, including a movable type and a mechanical press, for the very first time in human history, it was now possible to rapidly print multiple copies of a text. Before this period of history, where Johann had made literature more accessible to the masses by making it considerably cheaper to mass produce, the majority of common people on Earth were mostly illiterate. This was due largely to the fact that books were too expensive for the most poor people to afford. Therefore, books were not seen much as a part of daily life for most 15th century Europeans. In addition to this, the church was the primary authority over scripture because the clergy were the only ones that could read and had access to the scriptures. In the aftermath of the Protestant Reformation, the church, at least in the Protestant world, is no longer an authority over Scripture. Scripture is the highest authority because we can read it for ourselves. In this way, the church was disintermediated by the technology of literature. And this change in the technology of information ultimately led rise to the Protestant Reformation. I don't believe that Luther and Calvin would have had grounds for the Reformation. This rejection of the Roman Catholic Orthodox principle that recognized the church as the highest authority over the Word of God could not have been possible without a growing base of a literate populace with access to books, and in particular with access to the Holy Word of God. It would be less than 100 years after the invention of the Gutenberg press that Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door and spent the rest of his life in exile from the church, because what he was proposing was essentially completely redesigning the system around which society was structured. I would like to suggest that the microprocessor is as important of an invention as the Gutenberg press, and I would like to suggest that if the microprocessor was the Gutenberg press, now, less than 50 years after its invention, we have our theses nailed to the door. The theses, in this example, is the Bitcoin white paper, which we will get to in a moment. Just like how the church is no longer an authority over the Word of God, the state is no longer an authority over money because it was disintermediated by the microprocessor. We don't want to go back to the horse and buggy way of doing things either, which is gold and silver. I'll touch more on this in a moment as we talk about this problem of final settlement. We must remember that our tools are teleological. Remember, this means they are means to an end. We create tools to solve problems, and by solving problems, we improve the lives of our neighbors. Let's recap a bit on some of the lessons and problems that we identified in Part 1 and Part 2. In money, we have this problem known as final settlement. Now, as consumers, we're often not used to thinking about money in terms of final settlement. We see numbers in our bank account, we see numbers in our credit card statements, we see numbers in our Cash App, and to us, those things reflect final settlement because we're able to take that money and spend that money and obtain goods and services that we desire. But the actual banking system, as it functions today, has final settlement that occurs far out of band for what we experience as consumers. The best way to illustrate this is for us to go back to the days of physical gold. Recall that we identified one of the shortcomings of gold is its transportability and divisibility. This makes final settlement in specie, or gold and silver bullion, very difficult and expensive to achieve. Moving it across the seas requires fleets of warships and barges equipped to carry the weight. There's extreme risk of loss and theft during times of transport, and armed guards are also required to transport the gold. Moving it across land is an even more difficult endeavor than moving it across the ocean. It was because of this problem that we saw the rise of the technological innovation of banknotes. Gold would be stored in vaults, which were managed by large institutions that had the resources to achieve final settlement at scale. Banknotes could be traded between people in exchange for goods and services, and then banks would settle between themselves by redeeming banknotes at their point of issue and tracking debits and credits on interbank ledgers. The unfortunate problem that arises with this solution is that some banks can cheat. They might issue more banknotes than they have specie in vaults, or they might be incentivized by the government to hold government debt as collateral instead of gold and silver. This is how we ultimately ended up with our fiat money system of irredeemable banknotes, issued by the central bank, which is controlled by the government. And the system that we have today largely works in the same antiquated analog ways of final settlement as the previous did, except we no longer settle in gold and silver. Central banks keep ledgers of all of the debt and assets that are controlled and owned by them, and as well as their member banks. Interbank ledgers are settled on an arduously slow basis as funds move across the many pits of regulatory control and money-grubbing middlemen. Physical dollars were never meant to be used as final settlement. They were, in effect, IOUs. Settling a transaction made with physical dollars would require settling in the underlying gold that backed the issue of that banknote. Whereas today, money received by a merchant in the form of a credit card payment may take many weeks to settle in finality on interbank ledgers. Interbank ledgers allow financial entities to maintain a running bar tab with one another and settle the balance of those relationships periodically as they see fit. Nation states also do this as well to settle balances of trade. So it's important that we notice when we're talking about Bitcoin, we're talking about a bearer asset that settles in real time globally. It's okay if that doesn't make complete sense yet. We're going to talk through each bit of what all of that means and the implications of how it's actually achieved on a technological basis. But what's important to remember here is that achieving analog final settlement, meaning in the world that's not digital, was quite a big deal and very expensive. Trusted third parties between final settlement of money was a well-known problem long before Bitcoin. Until you actually get the money in hand, meaning in most cases throughout history the actual gold or silver, you didn't have the money in hand. There is a real risk when you delegate custodial authority of the world's money supply to a government or a bureaucratic agency. The state is simply not designed to be accountable to such a disastrous situation. The state was never given the authority by God to manipulate units of weight and measure. The state cannot speak things into being. It was the delegation of this authority to the state out of the necessity of economic scale that led rise to so many of our modern-day problems. Remember, the state has rules and limitations it must adhere to in accordance with God's law. We've covered this in part 1 of our series. Bitcoin is a modern monetary technological innovation that enables us to not just transact with one another, but allows for full final settlement with full assurance in real time, globally, without any permission and nearly instantly, especially when we compare it to the cost and settlement times of analog settlement of gold and silver, or even in the case of fiat money. This changes absolutely everything. This is the most exciting advancement in technology in your and my lifetime. I am convinced of that as much as I am convinced that 2 + 2 = 4. We have finally fixed the problem with technology in a clever way, and now it's simply a matter of using it, educating people, and building the software that makes sending money as easy as sending an email. Before we delve into the technical intricacies of how Bitcoin works and how it achieves such a remarkable innovation in the technology of money, we're going to talk about some of the history of modern monetary technological innovations. It's tempting to think that one of our best solutions is to go back to the way things used to be, where gold and silver IOUs are issued in the form of private banknotes. This is what I call the analog version of monetary technology. And a great modern example of this was a company called Liberty Dollars, which was a private bank that issued gold and silver backed currency from 1998 to 2009. I believe it was in 2008 or 2009 where the founders were charged with federal crimes. The founders were charged with federal crimes of making coins resembling and similar to U.S. coins. In the United States, we have what's called legal tender laws, and we also have counterfeiting laws. These laws force you to use the currency that was issued by the Federal Reserve and prohibit you from issuing your own private currencies for use in exchange in goods or services. This analog final settlement is far too inconvenient for the global Leviathan state of today, and it simply cannot be tolerated. The answer then here is not to return to the previous ways of doing things, which are so prone to many pitfalls of co-option due to the necessities of scale, but rather to find new innovative technologies that solve this problem digitally. You should know that Bitcoin was not the first attempt at solving this problem, and in fact, as far back as the 1980s, a group of people called the cypherpunks were working on digital cash systems. David Chaum's eCash came in the 1980s. Hashcash, which was a proof-of-work spam control protocol, was implemented by Adam Back in 1997. Wei Dai's B-Money, which was introduced in the 1990s, was the first proposal for a limited supply digital money. And then in 2004, Hal Finney developed the first currency based on reusable proof of work. However, there were major problems with these early attempts at digital money. Hashcash had no protection against double spending, and B-Money and BitGold were prone to Sybil attacks. To illustrate double spending, we should think of a person with a checking account. Writing a check, just like we used to do way back in the old days. If you have $100 in your bank account and you owe $100 to your gardener and $100 to your baker, and you write them both a check for $100, they're going to assume that they've been paid in full. However, whichever one of them makes it to the bank first will receive their money, and the second will be left with a worthless piece of paper. We have this same problem when innovating digital monies, and it's referred to as the double spend problem. A Sybil attack simply means the vulnerability to lots of fake participants sending fake data to a network and overloading it with information that's untrue. By creating many pseudonymous identities to participate in the network, you can overload the source of truth by bombarding it with information. In order to understand why Bitcoin is so different from the technological attempts at innovation that came before it, we need to understand a computer science concept known as the Byzantine generals problem. Let's assume that there are 6 generals, and they need to attack a fortified position with their armies. They know that if they can all attack at the exact same time, that their chances of success are nearly overwhelming. However, if even just 1 or 2 of them does not attack in unison with the rest of the group, then their chances of defeat are almost guaranteed. How can the generals communicate to each other in this hectic space of battle that they should all advance at the exact same time? How can they be sure that orders they are given are not sabotaged by the enemy? How can they be sure that one general is not a defector and leading the rest astray with bad commands? How can they know when is the time to retreat? Coordinating this message at scale in a real-time environment with lots of extraneous variables is a difficult problem to solve. The generals would need some way to guarantee that there was a majority consensus on when to advance, and that this message was true and authentic. In 2008, the Bitcoin white paper was published by a pseudonymous identity known as Satoshi Nakamoto. I'm going to read for you now the introduction of the Bitcoin white paper. Commerce on the internet has come to rely almost exclusively on financial institutions serving as trusted third parties to process electronic payments. While the system works well enough for most transactions, it still suffers from the inherent weakness of the trust-based model. Completely non-reversible transactions are not really possible since financial institutions cannot avoid mediating disputes. The cost of mediation increases transaction cost, limiting the minimum practical transaction size and cutting off the possibility for small, casual transactions. And there is a broader cost in the loss of ability to make non-reversible payments for non-reversible services. With the possibility of reversal, the need for trust spreads. Merchants must be wary of their customers. hassling them for more information than they would otherwise need. Remember, this was the double spend problem that we talked about earlier. This is what he means by reversibility. A certain percentage of fraud is accepted as unavoidable. These costs and payment uncertainties can be avoided in person by using physical currency. But no mechanism exists to make payments over a communications channel without a trusted third party. What is needed is an electronic payment system based on cryptographic proof instead of trust, allowing any two willing parties to transact directly with each other without the need for a trusted third party. Transactions that are computationally impractical to reverse would protect sellers from fraud, and routine escrow mechanisms could easily be implemented to protect buyers. In this paper, we propose a solution to the double spending problem using a peer-to-peer distributed timestamp server to generate computational proof of the chronological order of transactions. The system is secure as long as honest nodes collectively control more CPU power than any cooperating group of attacker nodes. The Bitcoin white paper and the Bitcoin code, which was released shortly after the publication of the white paper, was a breakthrough in monetary technology. It drew heavily from some of the early attempts at monetary innovation, and through a clever combination of existing old concepts, it was able to implement something called Nakamoto consensus, which solves the Byzantine generals problem. Through a combination of what's called proof of work, which is the expense of computational resources that costs real-world time and money, and the longest chain with the most accumulated proof of work rule, Satoshi was able to solve the double spend problem in a distributed autonomous network, and was also able to provide Sybil resistance to the network's consensus by ensuring that there was always one verifiable source of truth that was shared amongst all network participants. In order to understand how these problems were solved, we're going to need to talk through a few concepts of how Bitcoin works. Now, Bitcoin mining is probably one of the least understood aspects of Bitcoin in general, at least when it comes to the layman. Contrary to what you might have heard, Bitcoin miners are not solving complex math problems. Bitcoin mining is a random number guessing lottery. The first miner to guess the correct random number wins the next block. When a miner wins a block, which is approximately every 10 minutes, they are given the right to auction the space on that block off to the highest bidders. And as well, they collect something called the block subsidy, which is some newly issued Bitcoin that has never existed before. But we'll cover more about this later. Think about Bitcoin mining as a lottery that occurs every 10 minutes. With the amount of hash power that a miner contributes to guessing random numbers as a lottery ticket. Originally, this random number guessing was handled by the user's CPU on their computer. Eventually, some clever engineers were able to figure out how to harness the power of GPUs, which are graphics cards, rather than CPUs, and offered much more computational throughput. Over time, specialized circuits boards designed to be extremely good at this one specific thing, guessing random numbers, were commoditized and began being used at scale for Bitcoin mining. People no longer mine with CPUs or GPUs because they are simply non-competitive to the application-specific integrated circuit boards, or ASIC miners as we call them today. This commoditization of mining hardware has been very good for developing the robustness of the Bitcoin network security. Any attacker that wanted to change what the Bitcoin blockchain perceives as true would require more computational power than the rest of the network combined. This is simply unfeasible due to the global and distributed nature of hash power, and the high capital and operational intensities required to mine at scale. This combination incentivizes miners to collaborate on the same chain with the same history. Any attacker attempting to create a new or competing chain would need more computational power than the rest of the network combined, which is simply infeasible due to the capital and operational requirement of running large, specialized data centers at scale. There is a very real economic cost at participating in the Bitcoin mining lottery. Any unsuccessful attempts at cheating result in wasted resources and lost revenues. The incentives create an environment where anybody with access to specialized mining equipment is rewarded for participating fairly and punished for trying to break the rules. If a miner successfully wins the next block and attempts to enter fraudulent information into the network, the chain will reject this block and the miner will lose all of the money that they would have won had they participated fairly. We will return later to the topic of the block subsidy on how new Bitcoin is created, but for now we need to cover a few more basic computer science concepts. Now don't get scared, I promise this isn't that complicated, at least not to understand conceptually. Cryptography draws its name from the ancient Greek word kryptos, which means hidden secret. It is the practice or technique of securing communications in adversarial environments. In 1991, a man named Phil Zimmermann wrote a software program called PGP, which stood for Pretty Good Privacy. He made this software free and open source, meaning that he published it for anybody to use, anybody to change, anybody to sell in any commercial application. This was the first widely available program for public and private key cryptography. The only problem was, what he did was illegal, because cryptography was classified as a munition by the US government at the time, and thus subject to its arms and trafficking export controls. Eventually, the charges against him were dropped after the MIT press published the source code of Pretty Good Privacy, and made it available for everyone to use without anybody's permission. Without the availability of this encryption protocol, the internet today would not be as we know it. The majority of things that you enjoy being able to do, such as logging in to your private accounts across various websites, enjoying content from your favorite podcaster or YouTuber, or paying your bills by logging into your bank account, would simply not be possible had Phil Zimmermann not unleashed cryptography to the world in 1991. There would be no way for us to ensure any secure communication channels without the presence of sufficiently advanced cryptography and encryption. A public and private key pair is no more complicated than the idea of a username and a password. You can think about a public key simply as an email. A private key can simply be thought of as a password. If you know my public key, you can send me an email. But nobody can send an email from my email address unless they have my password. The same is true for cryptography. We can verify that a person is who they say they are by examining their public key, which is cryptographically associated with their password, or private key. Cryptography simply takes this idea of a username and a password and makes the passwords extremely large numbers, so large in fact that they're impossible for computers or humans to guess. I can understand why this might be a little bit overwhelming or a little bit difficult to comprehend, so I'm going to explain SecP 256K1, which is the encryption protocol used by Bitcoin, to explain how we know that this works with absolute certainty. The 256 in SecP 256 represents an exponent. This means that any SecP seed has 2 to 256 total possible seeds. Now, this is an impossibly large number. You can't even comprehend how large this number is. As humans, we can't conceptualize numbers this large, but I'm going to do my best to try to help you do that. So imagine that we have a stack of drawers, 10 drawers high. I realize that the drawers in this picture are 9 drawers high, but just assume that there's one more on top there. And imagine that this stack of drawers expands endlessly across the horizon. Each drawer represents a potential possible seed when using the SecP 256 elliptic curve. Now imagine that you had something very precious to you, something very important and secret that you didn't want anybody else to discover. Assuming you could walk in one direction along this virtually endless row of drawers, how far would you have to walk before you were comfortable that you had came across a drawer that you could safely place your precious valuable into and be certain that no one else would discover it? Would you walk for an hour? Would you walk for a week? Would you walk for 2 weeks? Would you walk for a year? Let's assume that each step you take in one direction moves you to the next set of 10 drawers for simplicity. The number of steps it would take you to reach the end would be 2 to the power of 256 divided by 10. If you walked for a year in one direction, 24 hours a day at a rate of 3 miles per hour, without stopping to take any breaks to eat or drink or sleep, you would cover approximately 26,280 miles of drawers. And if you walked for 100 years, without stopping whatsoever, 24 hours a day, you would cover 2,628,000 miles of drawers. After covering these 2.6 million miles of drawers, at the end you would have discovered 8.145 times 10 to the negative 71st power percentage of all drawers. Here's what that number looks like listed out. If you had 100 generations of children that came after you and continued your lifelong journey of traveling for 100 years in one direction for 24 hours a day at a rate of 3 miles per hour, at the end you would have discovered 8.14 times 10 to the negative 69% of all drawers. And here's that number listed out for you. As you should be able to see, these are just simply incomprehensibly large numbers for humans to contend with. In fact, there are not even enough atoms in the known universe for us to have as many drawers as we've conceptualized here. By having a computer generate a random number on the SecP 256 elliptic curve, as I've just explained above, we can with reasonable mathematical certainty assume that that number has never been picked before in human history and will never be picked again. So, rather than having to physically walk for hundreds of generations to find a drawer that no one had come across before, your computer does it for you. By guessing a very, very large number and using it as your password, we can ensure that everyone who participates in the Bitcoin network is who they say they are. Now that we understand a little bit about cryptography and we understand that each participant on the Bitcoin network is identified by their public-private key pair, we can talk about what Bitcoin is actually doing and how it works. Imagine I owned a bar and that you were a regular patron. Imagine I kept a board up on the wall that was a record of the tab which you owed me at the bar. One afternoon you come in and can't help but think that the number on the board is much higher than you remember the last time you came by. I suggest to you that in order to keep me honest, you should keep your own record of the board for reference, and we can compare our records together anytime there is a dispute. By each maintaining our own records of the bar tab, we can hold one another accountable to a single source of truth. Bitcoin nodes are a distributed ledger. That is, they are a global record of every transaction that has ever happened in the history of the Bitcoin blockchain. Nodes running the Bitcoin software autonomously compare one another's record of this distributed ledger of all transaction history in real time against each other. Nobody can cheat because everybody is held accountable by everybody else. And as we discussed earlier, through the clever combination of proof of work and the longest chain scenario, majority consensus is always dominant over the network. Any attempts to violate the protocol result in eviction. If you want to use the network, you simply have to participate by the rules. Bitcoin nodes are distributed all over the world, and anybody using the Bitcoin software is running a Bitcoin node and participating in the majority consensus established by the ledgers. Bitcoin is what's known as a distributed network. That is to say, it's not run in any one particular place. It's run by lots and lots of people all over the world on lots of different machines and in lots of different localities. Bitcoin is very much the Bitcoin network. The token, BTC, which represents monetary value within the network, cannot be extrapolated from the network itself. Without the network, the token would have no value. To use the token, one must participate in the network. To participate in the network, one must follow the rules. Bitcoin is a peer-to-peer cash system. This means that any participant in the network can, at any time, without permission, send money which they verifiably own given the control of their private key, to another person on the network. Peer-to-peer. This transaction does not require any third-party intermediaries to approve of or settle that transaction in finality. The user simply places a bid on how much they're willing to pay to have that transaction included in the next Bitcoin block, and miners are incentivized to pick up that transaction and include it in the block that they've won in their lottery by collecting the fees and payment. Distributed networks are notoriously robust and difficult to control. A great example we have is the distributed nature of torrents, which likewise are a distributed network of people hosting certain fragments of files all around the world on different computers. Someone who would like to download something, like say a movie, illegally, can tap into the torrent network and access the data being shared across thousands of computers all over the world. This is quite different from highly centralized networks like the website that your bank runs on, or Amazon, or Facebook. These networks are all run by centralized companies, and the presence of their infrastructure is located in tightly controlled, geographically small locations. Unlike distributed networks, like Bitcoin, maintained by people who run the software all over the world. Torrents have proven impossible to stop. Much to the chagrin of politicians and media conglomerates, the legislature has found itself unable to contend with the power of information sharing across distributed networks. By designing these distributed network protocols in such a way that they place low demands on systems for performance and networks for bandwidth requirements, they are able to maintain nearly 100% uptime, can run on a large variety of hardware and software environments, and are very difficult to detect and stop. It's important that we understand that a Bitcoin transaction is simply information. Much like how the Gutenberg press enabled the encoding of information into literature and distribution at scale, the microprocessor has allowed us to encode information into binary, or ones and zeros, which is the foundational principle of modern computer science. Information can be encoded into a great number of different schemes. One of the more common ones in early computing was 8-bit encoding. Using a series of numbers 0 through 7, we can represent any information that we choose just as we might with ones and zeros. Information can also be encoded in human-readable ways to represent very large values and numbers, such as Bitcoin seeds. For example, a Bitcoin password can be encoded into a 12-word phrase using common English words like steel, apple, danger, rope, ocean, corn. In this way, one could theoretically memorize their Bitcoin password and carry billions or trillions of dollars around with them in their brain. Because information can be encoded in many different forms, this means that it can also be passed across many different mediums. Information can be encoded using a process called lithography, which would allow you to encode a Bitcoin transaction or a Bitcoin password within a picture of your family. Radio wave modulation allows you to encode any information into binary and then digitize it across radio waves using amplitude modulation. High amplitude peaks represent a 1, low amplitude peaks represent a 0. Boom, you can send any information you want across radio waves. You could even encode a Bitcoin private key or transaction into pages of your favorite book or a dictionary. Because even in the most oppressive regimes in the world, information is nearly impossible to stop, this global distributed monetary network allows money to move across borders seamlessly. For the first time ever in human history, you could fly from the United States to China with your entire life savings inside of your head. For the first time in human history, money could be given to someone in a repressed regime like North Korea on a USB stick. Because the network is globally accessible and permissionless, nobody can stop you from sending money to a public key held by someone in Russia or Ukraine or Israel or Palestine. Think of any place in the world, and if you could get that person information, you could get them Bitcoin. The global nature of this permissionless monetary network also has profound implications on the individual's ability to move money at scale outside of typical geopolitical restrictions known as capital controls. Many countries make it quite difficult to move money in and out of their borders. With Bitcoin, this is no longer an issue. Many immigrants or refugees will send money back to their loved ones and family in a process known as remittance. This is often very cumbersome, very slow, and very expensive. With Bitcoin, it is no longer a problem. A globally distributed permissionless information network means that there is globally distributed permissionless money for the first time in human history. You may have come across unfortunate analogies comparing the throughput of Bitcoin transactions to something like that of Visa or MasterCard. And while it is true that the transactional capability of the Bitcoin network is much smaller than something like Visa or MasterCard, this is an apples to oranges comparison. Again, we must remember that the problem being solved here is that of final settlement of the bearer instrument. And Bitcoin is a programmable layer 1 money protocol. That is to say, it's the base layer money. Bitcoin is the bearer asset. It is the thing. It does not back anything. It is not redeemable for anything. If you have the Bitcoin, you have the thing. In software architecture design, there's a concept known as layered scaling. This means organizing the components of a system into distinct layers. Each layer is responsible for a specific aspect of functionality. This approach facilitates modularity, scalability, and ease of maintenance. It's a mistake to assume that Bitcoin at the base layer should facilitate all of the economic needs at scale of every individual in every circumstance. Given that Bitcoin is a programmable distributed information network, other layers which are better suited to facilitating low-cost or high-frequency use cases can be implemented to allow people to use Bitcoin without compromising the core design principles of the base layer protocol. The existing software architecture that we have on the internet today that works is built on top of this same principle. Layered protocols with responsibility to specific aspects of functionality allow you to do things like access websites and send emails. And we know, as the internet has continued to grow, that the layers built on top of these base protocols have allowed us to do things like stream movies and buy products off of Amazon and like a picture posted by our friend. In this same manner, Bitcoin is scaling in layers. And while we will not cover any of these layers specifically in this lecture for the sake of time, it's important to know that this layered scaling approach is the inevitable evolution of Bitcoin as the base layer of money. Now it is important that we should talk about the economics of the Bitcoin network. There will only ever be 21 million Bitcoin, period. This is a first for humanity. Unlike any other commodity throughout human history, Bitcoin has a fixed supply. There will only ever be 21 million Bitcoin. And the last of these Bitcoin will be issued approximately in the year 2137. These are the rules of the network, and in order to participate, you must abide by the rules. Earlier, we spoke very briefly about a concept known as the block subsidy. When a miner wins a block, adds valid transactions to it, and is accepted by the network as obeying the rules, they're rewarded with all of the fees from the transactions of users wishing to send Bitcoin, as well as something called the block subsidy. The block subsidy is newly created Bitcoin, and this is how all Bitcoin comes to be. 75% of the total supply of Bitcoin was issued during the first 8 years of its existence. Every 4 years, the amount of supply issued by the block subsidy gets cut in half in an event what's colloquially known as the halving. This does not change the existing supply of Bitcoin whatsoever. If you own 10 Bitcoin when the block subsidy is 50, after the halving, you still own 10 Bitcoin. The only thing that changes is the block subsidy rate. That is the rate of new Bitcoin that gets created every 10 minutes when miners discover a new block. As the total amount of new Bitcoin being created gets cut in half every 4 years, eventually we reach our terminal total supply of 21 million Bitcoin. One important point to note is that we are currently in our 5th epoch. That means that there have been 4 halvings up until this point, and that as of the making of this video, 93.77% of all Bitcoin that will ever exist have already been issued. At the end of our current epoch, which will be approximately in 2028, 96.875% of all Bitcoin that will ever exist will have been issued. While the inflation rate of Bitcoin was very high during the first decade of its existence, the rate of inflation today will only add 3.125% to the circulating supply across this 4-year epoch. This is a lower inflation rate than that of gold, as it's produced naturally, being mined and extracted and refined from the earth. As you can see from this graphic, Bitcoin began as quite an inflationary monetary instrument. This was good, as it front-loaded a lot of the requirements for the network to bootstrap itself early on. Early participants of Bitcoin were rewarded with higher block subsidies. And as more and more participants have joined the network, fees have gradually begun to outpace the rate of block subsidy for each block reward. We are quickly approaching a place where new Bitcoin issued by the block subsidy is negligible in size relative to the existing Bitcoin supply. The importance of this cannot be understated. For the first time in human history, there is a commoditized monetary instrument with a fixed supply. The majority of the inflation is already behind us. What lies ahead is a very painful lesson in economic reality for the vast majority of people living. But the benefits of this technological innovation far outweigh the negatives. By having a money with a fixed set of rules and a fixed supply, enforced by the consensus of a distributed network in which no one can cheat, we can guarantee that there is an accessible, sound weight and measure of economic value for everybody. The magnitude to which Bitcoin improves upon its predecessors of monetary technology are orders of magnitude to which we can scarcely comprehend. The problems that we require to solve with money, outlined in part 2 of this series, have been solved so totally and completely, and in an affordable way. So to recap, the block reward is the amount of Bitcoin that gets paid to a miner who successfully guesses the right random number and includes transactions from network participants without cheating in such a way that it gets accepted by the network. The block reward includes the fees paid by users who want to send Bitcoin and the block subsidy, which is the inflation rate of new Bitcoin. Fees function as an anti-spam mechanism that prevent people from sending lots of very, very small transactions on the Bitcoin network and wasting space on the blockchain, as well as facilitating a market price for final settlement on an unchangeable ledger where nobody can cheat with limited space. Now, it may sound to you like I'm being overly optimistic about the promises of this new technology. What stops somebody from simply copying Bitcoin? What stops somebody from simply making up their own rules and starting a new Bitcoin? In order to understand this, we need to remember that Bitcoin is an information network. Networks and their value are exponential in the sense that each new participant in the network brings an exponential return of increased value to the existing users of the network. Consider, for example, the telephone. If I had lived in the 19th century and known Alexander Graham Bell, and if Alexander Graham Bell had invented the first telephone and given me the second telephone, the value of that network would be pretty low. I would only be able to call Alexander, and Alexander would only be able to call me. However, if we introduced a third telephone to our network, suddenly the value of our network has grown exponentially. I can now call either Alexander or the third participant. The third participant can call either myself or Alexander. Alexander can now call either me or the third participant. The value of our network has grown exponentially because participation in the network has grown linearly. The same concept is true for Bitcoin. Any attempts at creating a new or a separate or a better Bitcoin cannot recreate or transfer the existing Bitcoin network. If I were to invent an entirely new type of phone that sent messages through vibrations in the earth, rather than across electrical signals on telephone wires, I could still only use it to talk to myself, and the value of that network would not grow until there were other participants. Joining new networks has a very high cost, and often requires a very large order of magnitude improvement to justify adoption. Bitcoin was a magnum opus moment for this. As we can see throughout the 20th century, various technologies that offered huge improvements to people's quality of life have been increasingly adopted on steeper and steeper exponential scales. This is due in part to the rate at which our information networks grow. People have become more and more aware and accepting of new technological innovations. In addition, as our industrial capabilities have advanced, our ability to provide people with more and more of the things that make their life better become increasingly attainable. The value of computers or email or the internet was not very clear in the 1980s, but by the mid-2000s it was all the rage. And now we can scarcely imagine living in a world or doing business in a world without the internet. Networks change exponentially, and the value of those networks grow in tandem with the entry of new users. This is important that we do not forget, because Bitcoin itself is an information network. Now I think I've given you enough of a general understanding of the various concepts around Bitcoin that you should at least have an idea how it works, what clever things it does to solve problems, and why I think it's going to be successful. However, there's an elephant in the room that we need to address. I'm sure you've had a friend involved in cryptocurrencies. Maybe you've even gotten involved into them yourself. And this can be a difficult conversation, because a lot of people have found their identities wrapped up in these things. But I'm here to tell you that cryptocurrencies are literally all scams. Every single one of them has a team behind them, enriching themselves and deceiving investors by making absurd and false claims. What they are doing is also illegal, as all crypto tokens fall under well-established criteria of securities fraud. There's not a debate to be had here. This is not a point of contention. This is simply groups of people that are willfully being deceived and deceiving others for the sake of profit. Cryptocurrencies go hand in hand with deception, smoke and mirrors, snake oil, Ponzi scams, and illegal unregistered securities offerings. As we speak, the SEC has been engaged in heavy-handed litigation against increasingly large amounts of crypto companies. That is because these crypto tokens fall well under the established guidelines of securities law. And while I certainly don't always agree with the modern legislative body, in this case, I absolutely agree. Bitcoin is unique in the sense that it was the first of its kind. Bitcoin is leaderless. Bitcoin has been classified as a commodity, not as a security by the US government court system. This is, of course, not an ultimate authority, but I personally believe that it's the correct interpretation and application in the case of cryptocurrency tokens. Let's get into a few examples of what makes Bitcoin different from some of these other cryptocurrency tokens, which I believe are all entirely scams designed to defraud investors of their money. Firstly, when thinking about engineering and system architecture design, we must understand that all engineering decisions come with trade-offs. Bitcoin is open source software, and because it's open source software, anybody can change the code. Anybody can contribute to it. Any new or innovative breakthroughs with reasonable engineering trade-offs that improve our ability to operate an autonomous global monetary network can be implemented into the Bitcoin code. Bitcoin's value lies in its network, which is secure, distributed, and highly liquid. Competitors blatantly deceive their investors, which I call customers, about the technical aspects of their digital monies. They usually prey on others with sophisticated, cultish, con-man-esque manipulation tactics in order to be successful. These tactics very often involve claiming that their crypto token is cheaper, faster, better, stronger, smarter than Bitcoin in some way. It's all lies. Engineering has trade-offs, and to make a distributed final settlement network of Bitcoin cheaper, or faster, or stronger, or smarter, requires giving up certain things that are integral to the core design principles of Bitcoin that have made it successful. Companies that create crypto tokens benefit off of this asymmetric gap in understanding the average person has about what Bitcoin is, how it works, and what problems it solves, by misleading people about the capabilities of their quote-unquote new technologies. Let's say, for example, I create a brand new token. On day one, when the protocol first launches, I've set it up in such a way that I already own 70% of the total supply on day one. In crypto, this is what's known as a pre-mine. Of course, I'm going to do everything I can to convince you to buy some of my token. I'm willing to tell you pretty much anything to get you to buy it, because it solves a problem for me, and my problem is my empty wallet. And in fact, this scenario that I just described to you describes exactly what the largest competing cryptocurrency did. When the Ethereum Foundation created the Ethereum token, they gave themselves 70% of the total Ethereum supply and sold it to early investors. They sold this Ethereum to their investors under the premise that it would go up in value. They were able to promote this investment on behalf of the efforts of the team behind the Ethereum Foundation. This includes marketing people, engineering people, sales people, support people. Ethereum, as a technological innovation, is a dumpster fire, and that's because it was never designed to be a technological innovation. It's bloated and highly centralized. It will get taken down by the United States government eventually. Let's take Bitcoin, on the other hand, which had no pre-mine. And Satoshi, for example, has never even moved any of his coins, although I would argue that he has every right to. Bitcoin is a leaderless protocol. It has no CEO, no founders, no investors, no marketing teams, no sales teams, no support teams, no technical teams. Con men who are trying to sell you the next iteration of money have all of those things. Leaderless, decentralized protocols, by their very nature, can simply not have companies behind them, promoting them, engineering them, dictating the rules by which you can participate. These are simply language games. Cryptocurrencies are no more decentralized than Facebook is decentralized. The first mover advantage that Bitcoin has gives it a massive head start in terms of its liquidity, network activity and connectivity, economic density, and software development. Anything that's new and of technical merit can be implemented into Bitcoin, as we said before. Any unforeseen disaster down the road can also be mitigated in Bitcoin through the collaboration of open source software engineers. Remember, networks become more valuable as their user base grows. And remember, Bitcoin is free and open source software. Any substantial breakthrough with a worthwhile engineering trade-off can be implemented on Bitcoin, and all engineering decisions have trade-offs. However, it's not enough for us to say simply that because these crypto tokens have CEOs and companies behind them, that they are not sufficiently decentralized. The decentralization, or lack thereof, of these networks can be observed by looking at the hard facts and figures about the network distribution. Bitcoin has been designed from the ground up to have a slow and sustainable growth of the size of the ledger. Remember, this ledger contains a list of all of the transactions that have ever happened in the history of Bitcoin. If that list grows too quickly, it becomes unsustainable for the average person to be able to run the Bitcoin software. As the base layer becomes bloated with more and more features and bad engineering trade-offs, storage size and computational requirements grow. And in fact, this is exactly what has happened in the case of Ethereum. None of the participants in the Ethereum network run Ethereum nodes. It's simply prohibitive to do so. The only Ethereum nodes that do exist, that set the rules of the network, are run on large data centers, like Amazon Web Service, and the majority of them are maintained by the Ethereum Foundation. So they own most of the network, they write most of the software, and they run most of the nodes. They effectively control the network distribution. Contrast this with the network distribution of something like Bitcoin. There are thousands of nodes being run all over the world, run by individuals that simply want to participate in the network. Anybody can download the Bitcoin software onto their computer and start being a participant. This is not the case in many other cryptocurrency protocols. The next point that we should consider is the magnitude of energy and hardware backing the Bitcoin settlement assurance. Remember earlier we covered this idea that miners could only cheat if they somehow were able to get more computational power than the rest of the network combined. It is this cumulative hash power, all of these different Bitcoin miners all around the world competing to win the next block, that provides us our settlement assurance. Alternative cryptocurrencies, particularly in the case of proof-of-work cryptocurrencies, are much slower to achieve equivalent level of final settlement assurance as Bitcoin. Here you can see some examples of some minority proof-of-work cryptocurrencies that have a much smaller amount of electricity and hardware contributing to their mining. Simply by their very nature, even though they might claim to be faster in the intermediate term, a considerably longer amount of time is required to achieve the same level of transaction finality on, say, Dogecoin as with Bitcoin. This is because much more resources are expended in the production of a single Bitcoin block than in any other competing minority chain. Not only is the settlement assurance much lower for these competing protocols, but they face significant vulnerabilities due to the presence of significantly more mining power in the Bitcoin ecosystem. This leaves them open to attacks on their single source of truth. Cryptocurrencies have layers upon layers of deception. The final concern that I would like to address is in regards to concerns over Bitcoin's energy use, especially when compared to other cryptocurrencies that might use less effective consensus mechanisms that utilize less electricity. First of all, the consumption of energy is a good thing, not a bad thing. God put us on this earth with plenty of resources to sustain quite a lot more people than we currently have. I am quite confident of that. Energy consumption improves our quality of life drastically. Longevity and stature is closely linked with energy consumption per capita across the world. Bitcoin uses a lot of energy because it solves really important problems for lots of people all over the world. Its never-ceasing demand for more energy is useful for a lot of things, like grid stabilization and stranded energy arbitrage and gas emission compliance. Remember, energy is a tool that we use to solve problems. More of it is a good thing. Using more of it creates opportunities to produce more of it. One problem with energy is that it's very difficult and expensive to transport. It's much easier to make lots of energy very close to where it's needed than to make lots of energy and try to transport it very far away. It can be difficult to manage spikes in energy demand around human activity. Bitcoin can help here by offering grid stabilization in the form of managed demand by keeping power consumption consistent in the off-demand hours of human activity. Said another way, your power plant may need to produce a certain amount of electricity to meet peak demand when everybody gets home from work or wakes up in the morning and makes their coffee. It's much easier for them to make that amount of energy consistently throughout the day, but they need to stabilize that grid somehow when everybody's at work and not using as much power. Energy demand is cyclical. By integrating Bitcoin mining operations into our energy grids, we can use them to load balance energy production with the ebbs and flows of energy demand. Rural communities are also financially incentivized to increase their power generation and distribution capabilities, thereby increasing their wealth and quality of life. How that power is then used is largely the responsibility of the ones who are paying for it. New demand creates new innovation. New innovation creates new jobs. New jobs create new opportunities. Naturally occurring sources of energy like geothermal power are encouraged to be tapped, such as in the cases of countries like El Salvador, who have expanded the country's access to geothermal power explicitly with the intentions of using it to mine Bitcoin. The El Salvadorian president has promised his constituents free power for life because of the abundance of energy that this endeavor has allowed them to obtain. Additionally, some energy is cheaper to release than transport. Bitcoin also offers opportunities here too. Massive mobile mining data centers can be transported to far remote locations, otherwise inaccessible, and consume otherwise wasted energy, such as vented methane from mining operations. Miners are incentivized to seek out the lowest or negative cost energy in cases like this, which help improve their profit margins. Likewise, oil and gas wells are then no longer prohibited in the amount of energy that they can produce because they're not required to vent that methane into the atmosphere. It can simply be harnessed by a local generator, turned into electricity, and monetized for Bitcoin. Cryptocurrencies that claim to offer alternative consensus mechanisms that are less computationally expensive than proof of work, such as proof of stake, are simply undesirable. But not only are they undesirable, they are ineffective. They cannot, by their very nature, impose the same real-world costs on fair participation in the network. Proof-of-stake consensus mechanisms and any other alternatives that claim to be solving the problems of energy usage in Bitcoin are merely engaging in the deceptive tactics of not acknowledging engineering trade-offs in system design. Additionally, blockchain technology is not useful as an information technology application outside of Bitcoin itself. Bitcoin is the only secure blockchain because the incentives of the network align to force participants to abide by the rules. Blockchain without Bitcoin is just simply somebody's slow, inefficient database. Blockchain is only useful for solving the double spend problem in money and does not have useful applications outside of this concept. Any attempts at implementing blockchain technology outside of Bitcoin have failed miserably and ended up being replaced with other technologies that are better suited to this purpose. Likewise, physical commodities like gold cannot be issued on the Bitcoin blockchain. Bitcoin only works as a self-clearing global monetary network because the token, BTC, that represents economic value, is intrinsic to the network itself. The network can clear all transactions and settle them in finality within the confines of the rules of the network. If we were to try to place gold on the blockchain, we'd simply be recreating a less efficient version of banknote IOUs issued by trusted third parties. Gold would still require being physically warehoused and settled between intermediaries as transactions were resolved across the world. Likewise, property ownership over non-intrinsic digital items, such as non-fungible tokens, cannot be reconciled intrinsically within the Bitcoin network. There are all kinds of incentives that work against the ideas of NFTs and ownership of digital items beyond the Bitcoin token native to the Bitcoin ecosystem. I've done other videos on the topic of NFTs. If you're interested in this, you should look for those where I've gone into great detail about why this concept doesn't work as a business strategy and certainly doesn't work for the consumer. So in conclusion, I believe that Bitcoin is the next technological evolution of money. I believe that Bitcoin is a sound weight and measure of economic value, and in accordance with the economic laws outlined to us in Scripture. Bitcoin is a globally distributed and permissionless network. Bitcoin is a free and open source software protocol. And in the interest of time, I could only touch on many of these subjects very briefly. If you want a more extensive course on Bitcoin, I highly suggest the website 10hoursofbitcoin.com, which I think does a good job of highlighting all of the various breadths of Bitcoin in a bit more depth than I could cover here. I hope you enjoyed this series and found some wisdom in it. If you did, please share it with your friends and family. In the future, I may publish a part 4 for Q&A and revisit on certain topics if I get enough questions on a particular topic that I think is worthy of detailed responses, or if people just want to know more about certain things or want me to go back to certain things and explain more, I will absolutely do that. Thanks so much for listening, and I hope you learned something.